Hi everyone, we'll be starting in a minute or two once everyone has joined. Okay, great. Hi everyone, welcome to Open Democracy's weekly live discussion. I'm Nandini Archer. I am Global Commissioning Editor with Open Democracy. I'm based in London on our gender team, doing mainly feminist investigative journalism and telling stories of feminist resistance. And we have a weekly live discussion like the one we're about to have. And I think this is going to be the best one yet. So we want this conversation to involve as many of you as possible. So particularly thank you for all those who submitted their questions and comments ahead of time. We're going to try and address as many of them as we can. So if you're joining us on Zoom and you have a question or a comment for us, click on the chat icon at the bottom of your screen and type into the chat window. People who are watching on Facebook can also put their questions in comments there and my colleague will get to them. So this week's topic is, how is the British police crackdown bill a threat to democracy? So the police crime sentencing and courts bill creates new stop and search powers, allows the police to put more conditions on protests and threatens Gypsy and Traveller rights to roam, among other things. It's been met with mass protests. And so today we're discussing whether this bill is a threat to our human rights and whether there is any stopping it now. So before we kick off, I want to introduce the panel. We have Gracie Bradley, who is Interim Director of Liberty. We have Moya Lothian-Mclean, who is Politics Editor at gal-dem. We have Luke Smith, who is founder of GRT, Gypsy, Roma and Traveller, Socialists. And we have Zarah Sultana, who is a Labour MP. So let's really get started with some general background questions to understand what this bill is and what's so concerning about it. And to start off, Gracie, you'll have quite a broad overview of the human rights implications of this bill. So let me go to you first. Why are we talking about this bill and what exactly is so scary about it?
Thanks, Nandini. So yeah, the policing bill, and I'm really glad that everyone has been calling it the police crackdown bill, because that is what it is. It's an all-out assault on human rights on many fronts. You know, we've heard a lot about the provisions on protest, which I'll come to in a minute, but what I really don't want us to lose is the breadth of this threat to a range of communities, and that's why I'm really glad that you pulled this panel together this evening. So on policing, first of all, this bill will expand stop and search powers. It's going to make it easier for police to harass people with prior convictions, and that's going to disproportionately affect young Black men. It also establishes a serious violence reduction duty, and this is basically a prevent style duty for serious violence. And what this is going to do is encourage people, public servants and public service providers, to share private data on people, most likely on the basis of crude stereotypes. And that is going to leave people with fewer and fewer places to turn to for support. And again, that's going to disproportionately affect racialized and working class communities. And finally, on the policing front, we see that this bill is going to make it easier to establish more secure schools, meaning more capacity to put young people in prison. And this is also going to be racist, it will be ableist, and of course, it's going to disproportionately affect working class youth. And I know we'll talk more about the bill's impact on Gypsy, Roma and Traveller communities, but in a nutshell, the bill is going to hand the police more powers. Most police have said they don't want these powers, to enforce against what they call unauthorised encampments and to criminalise trespass. And that's going to disrupt and criminalise Gypsy, Roma and Traveller communities. And finally, the part that I know that lots of people have been talking about, this bill is going to make it easier to impose conditions on protest at lower thresholds while raising the penalties for breaching them. And essentially, it aims to hand the police way more powers that they do not need to effectively extinguish protest rights. So that's the broad sweep of this bill. And I would just say it has to be set in the broader context of a government war on accountability mechanisms. So at the same time as the government trying to clamp down on protest and silence us that way, it's also trying to water down our Human Rights Act. It's trying to curtail judicial review, which is a legal process that means that public bodies can be held to account. It's tried to sideline Parliament through prorogation and throughout the pandemic. And now here we are with this bill, this crackdown on our protest rights. So we have to see it within that broad context of a crackdown on our right to speak out and our right to hold the state and public authorities to account. So that's the doom and gloom. I do have chirpier things to say later, but I will leave it there.
Thanks so much, Gracie. That was a really beautiful overview of a very ugly bill. And so next really to Zarah, then building on this, could you explain what your position on this bill was and is and why?
Of course. So this bill in particular was something that was demanded by the Home Secretary after the huge protests we've seen in recent times. We've seen Extinction Rebellion protests, we've seen Black Lives Matter protests, and there was a lobbying that took place between the Metropolitan Police and the government calling for powers to crack down on protests. And this specific bill, there was no white paper or green paper, which you usually expect before a bill is presented in Parliament, or a draft bill, nothing of the sort. And it was published just 6 days before MPs had a chance to vote on it. And that goes against usual convention that we expect to allow scrutiny. And I opposed it because I've seen, like so many others, a huge trend that has been part of this government's trajectory of ascending into authoritarianism. We've had various bills, including the Spy Cops bill, which gives the power of the power to state agents to commit rape, torture, and murder, the Overseas Operations Bill, where the government effectively wanted to decriminalize torture and crimes. And while they have actually backtracked on some of that legislation by exempting genocide and torture, no longer exempting genocide and torture, you can see where this government is going. And like Gracie said, it's just a full-blown attack on our civil liberties, both here domestically and abroad. And for me, that is obviously a huge concern. And I think it's really important to note that initially the Labour Party position on this legislation was to abstain. And it was because of people protesting, going out into the streets, led by Sisters Uncar, that we were able to change our position. I would have voted against it regardless, but I think it's really important to show that it was the power of protest that led to that change in party position from the Labour leadership.
Great, thank you so much for that. And so now to Luke. A big part of this bill, of course, is its focus on Gypsy and Traveller communities. And you said before that it seeks to criminalise your community's very way of life. Could you explain this a bit more and expand to those who might not quite understand that connection?
Okay, yeah, so I'm happy to explain this. So 15 to 20% of our community still live nomadically. So 99% of human history, pretty much. It was the norm to be nomadic. It's only a relatively recent in sort of the history of humankind that we live in houses, we farm the land, we work for aristocrats, we do this, that, and the other. And there's two communities that are mainly affected by this, and that's Irish travellers. So they're native to these sort of islands. They're Celtic people. They have a Celtic language. And then people like me, Romani Gypsies, who are originally from India, who came here about 500 years ago. But this, surprise, surprise, this isn't the first time we've experienced this sort of discrimination. It's not the first time we've experienced pogroms in this country and had our assets seized. Had our children removed from us and had us deported to all the colonies and things like that. The last tyrant that came along was Henry VIII with the Egyptians Act of 1530, and Priti Patel feeds into that perfectly. If you look at that historic act and you look at Priti Patel's act, very similar. I'll explain how it really affects us. So it's our historic way of life, remember. People have lived like this for hundreds of years. Before it was trailers, it was wagons and vardos, and my family have lived in those forever, basically. I now live in a house, my family live in a house now, but that's not the point. So this bill criminalises a community, the most vulnerable and the most poor in our community, by the way. It suggests fines of up to £2,500, 3-month prison sentences, the seizure of assets and goods, and there's some, there's a wider picture to this. So the wider picture is that we experience police brutality on a massive scale. When you see Dale Farm, the pictures aren't that dissimilar from the Met battering people at the vigil. They're not dissimilar to Bristol and everywhere else. But we've been doing that. This is normal operating, for us. That's what we sort of experience all the time. Now, this bill on the seizure of assets gives those same police officers that batter us and drag an Irish traveller woman who's epileptic and pregnant across a common until she has an epileptic fit. These same police officers that let their dog almost tear a man's leg off, these same police officers now have the power at their discretion to seize our assets if we have the intent to reside. So it's the racist police officers that now have that power over our lives. They can come and seize our goods and they get to make that decision. Now, the worst part of this bill that affects our community isn't actually written in the bill. It's a consequence of, the 3-month prison sentences, because, if you put somebody's parents in prison for 3 months, what happens to the children? They get forcibly adopted into the social care system and, childcare and things like that. And this isn't the first time this state has done that. We have a long history in this country of forcibly adopting Gypsy and Traveller children and putting them with non-Gypsy and Traveller families. And it's a form of forced assimilation. So that's the most worrying part of the bill. Like I say, these people don't have a lot. This is a form of homelessness that they're criminalising. And it goes on to the backdrop. If they really wanted to solve this issue, this wouldn't even be anywhere near the Home Secretary. It wouldn't be anywhere near the Home Office, and it wouldn't be anywhere near the justice system. What it needs to be with the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government providing sites for our community to live on, or having a strategy of negotiated stopping, so these people could stop in one area and be provided all the services that normal people, non-Gypsy and Traveller people take for granted: bins, toilets, access to clean water, which some of our community haven't even had access to over the pandemic. In the 6th richest country in the world. But I'll kind of leave it there. But yeah, like I say, I'll finish on this. There's a shortage of transit sites. There's a shortage of permanent sites. There's even a bigger shortage of negotiated stopping. So it means you are criminalising a form of homelessness. And what happens when they take our vehicles and stuff and it's sat in the justice system for over a year? It means they become conventionally homeless. I don't call it the Police and Crimes and Sentencing Bill. I don't call it, what the previous bill, I call it the pogroms bill, because that's what this is. These are pogroms, and don't let anybody tell you any different. And at some point, everybody's going to have to choose a side in this. But yeah, I'll finish with that. Thank you for having me in the first place. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks, Luke. And so next to Moya, and both Luke and Zarah mentioned this. Many people, this bill wasn't really part of public discussion. It wasn't really on the radar for much media, for instance. And then the Sarah Everard vigil happened in Clapham, South London, and suddenly Kill the Bill was everywhere. How is this bill connected to that moment and what happened there?
Well, I mean, I think it's several ways. I think, first of all, obviously, you have the direct fact that we got to see what police further criminalising protest would look like. So you had the images from Clapham, which came out where the police were there. They were so heavy-handed. They said that the protest was illegal and couldn't happen. So they cracked down on it. And that's what will continue to happen, because criminalising protest is not going to stop protest. It's just going to increase the level of violence. But I also think that it was, the Kill the Bill movement is linked to Sarah Everard, because Sarah Everard's death, and the man charged with her death currently is a Metropolitan serving, well, he was a Metropolitan serving police officer. And I think unconsciously people automatically drew that link, in that this bill seeks to equip the police with so much more power. It seeks to make the whole model even more punitive. It wants to charge every sort of social ill to the hands of the police for them to deal with. And Sarah Everard's, the man charged with her death, being a serving police officer, people suddenly thought, why are we automatically putting this trust in the police to do that? Maybe there's something else that could happen here. And I think suddenly woke up that the police aren't a neutral force. And for a lot of us, we already knew that. But for others, I think it was a bit of a shock to realize that the police aren't this neutral force. It's an institution that has been found institutionally racist, it's institutionally sexist, but it's also made up of individuals that subscribe to that sort of institutional violence that is present within the police. And that suddenly rushing through a bill that would give them so much more power, especially over marginalized communities in so many different ways, was horrendous. The thought of that was just so terrifying that we've seen this massive coalition come about as a result of that. And that is heartening, but I'm sure we'll talk about that a bit more later.
Brilliant, thank you. And so I'm going to go back to Gracie, because one of the questions we got from the audience ahead of this discussion was whether you could explain a bit more about other areas of the bill that haven't caught that public attention. And this person in particular said that the kind of threat to protests has been increasingly talked about, but wondered whether there are any other parts that the general public should be more aware of, and whether you could break that down for them.
Yeah, well, I think Luke's already done a pretty good job on some aspects of the bill. And, I would return to those aspects around policing specifically, because I think, Zarah, you mentioned the lack of consultation. And the very annoying and dangerous thing about this bill is that it's an amalgamation of several initiatives from over several years into one mega carceral punitive bit of legislation. And so this thing about serious violence reduction orders, that was something that was in the water when Sajid Javid was Home Secretary. And that's something that was consulted on. And obviously Liberty said, this is prevent, but for knife crime rather than so-called extremism. Why would you do this again? Of course, the government was at the same time in the process of stitching up the so-called independent review of prevent. So, it's all linked. But I think this thing about the serious violence reduction orders and the additional stop and search powers, it's really, really important, because it's a real slap in the face to everything that people who went out to say Black Lives Matter have been calling for. It's not just the crackdown on protest, it's also we hear you saying you don't want to be oppressed by the state anymore. By the way, we're going to hand the police more stop and search powers, right? That's really insulting, and it's really divisive. And I think that part of the bill is specifically about allowing the police to stop and search without reasonable grounds people who've had prior convictions. So that's people who may already have been profiled in some way, who've already interacted with the criminal punishment system in a way that was likely to be ableist and classist and racially disproportionate. And that's all done, and they're trying to rebuild their lives. And the fact that they have a prior conviction for something to do with a knife or serious violence, the police can stop and search them just for that. They don't need reasonable grounds. So that's really trapping people. It's very difficult to see a way out of that for people. And it also turns the presumption of innocence completely on its head, because, there are people who believe that prisons are there for rehabilitation. I'm not one of them. But, if you believe that prison is there for somebody to be punished, and then society says, okay, you're done, you've had a chance to reform, go on and live your life. This stop and search power, it's the opposite. It says you had a conviction before, you may have been punished already, however, we're going to continue to harass you. So I think it's really important to understand the impact of those proposed stop and search powers on marginalised people. And similarly, how counterproductive this new serious violence reduction duty is going to be. Because if you are in some kind of trouble and you do need somewhere to go, what happens when you can't trust your doctor, you can't trust your teacher, you can't trust your housing officer, you can't trust your youth worker, because all of them have been told you need to share information on this person if you suspect X, Y, and Z. So, and when you look at those provisions against the fact that the bill will massively expand capacity to incarcerate people for longer, you see just how trapping a spiral it is. So I think those parts of the bill, they're not sexy. I am not sure that we will get cross-party opposition to them, but I think they say an awful lot about what the state thinks about people who make mistakes, how we should treat them, whether anybody is redeemable, whether those people are really human, and whether we support people or whether we kind of just shunt people to one side and we say you're a lost cause. It really says something about what the state thinks of certain people. So yeah.
Great, thank you. And kind of connected to that, one of the questions I got ahead of this session was and this goes to anyone on the panel, whoever wants to answer it. Why do you think, in memory of Stephen Lawrence, it's so important to resist this bill?
I mean, I'm happy to answer that. It's in memory of every single person who's ever been let down by the police in any sort of way, whether that's directly is due to deaths in police custody, whether that's simply being criminalized by them. Stephen Lawrence was let down, obviously, because the police institutional racism prevented his murder being solved, caused his family to be infiltrated and surveilled by police officers who were meant to be guiding and protecting them at the time. I also just wanted to add to Gracie's point earlier about things within the bill that we might have missed and we might not be aware of. So alongside the sort of like additional stop and search powers, I don't know if we mentioned data sharing. So there's this bill would create and impose on local authorities and education authorities, health authorities, etc., to share data with the police and other authorities to prevent that serious violence or becoming the victim of serious violence. But as we've seen in the past, then like essential services like healthcare or local authorities responsible for, say, social housing, it means that vulnerable populations are way less likely to turn to them for support and help. So, you know, you can see in examples of, say, like migrant women tied to spousal visas who are afraid to report domestic violence because of Home Office data sharing. Data sharing really causes harm and it further criminalizes. You see it with the gangs matrix and predictive policing. So that's a massive one as well. And they also want to expand remote justice. So it would enable the use of audio and video for like a much wider range of criminal proceedings than is already in place, which they found that it leads to a much higher risk of unfair trials for defendants or who are particularly neurodivergent or disabled, and could lead to a likelihood of harsher sentences. So I know that diverged a bit away from your initial question, but I wanted to add that in because I felt like it was really important.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. And if anyone else has anything to add, feel free to jump in.
Can I just quickly add something on the back of that? I just wanted to say that politicians keep coming along and saying the Human Rights Act is going to protect us. And it's really, I'm finding it very irritating at the minute, especially human rights lawyers and the rest of it, because this Home Secretary has declared her intent to lessen that coverage of the Human Rights Act and reform it and change it and everything else. So this idea that, you know, my community is going to be saved by the Human Rights Act is frankly a disgrace. And somebody that studied at Oxford should know bloody better. So that's all I wanted to say on that. I just thought that was a quick one. Also wanted to add that this idea that, you know, we're going to have this electoral politics thing and they're all going to come along and save us, get that out of your heads now, because that's gone. That's too far gone for that. And as much as I think Zarah's amazing and everything like that, there isn't enough of Zarah's in Parliament. Therefore, we can't rely on that. But what I wanted to say is that the Labour Party as well has created consent for the abuse of my community, just as the Tories have with their leaflets and everything else. And I just wanted to allude to a tiny little microcosm of what's happening across the whole country in Warrington. What the problem with Warrington is that there's a Labour council there who's handing out leaflets saying that our community, saying we're incursions, invasions, and having language about us like we're vermin, right? But they're sitting on £2 million for a transit site. So what they're saying is that we've created the problem. We can't be bothered to fix it and build this transit site. But we're still going to hand out leaflets to incite racial violence and racial hatred. And the Conservatives and lots of councils and from all parties all around the country have been doing this. And that's what's created consent for this sort of thing. And I think that's awful. And I think people need to know that that isn't okay. Another part of the bill that really concerns people like me is the secure schools bit about incarcerating our youth, because our youth don't need more prison. Our youth don't need more carceral state solution. What we need is grassroots boxing, grassroots sports, everything else, youth clubs, you know, investment, get access to employment and socio-economic, you know, improvement basically. And this bill does that. But I just wanted to point out that you really need to now start getting on the side of doing something in the streets and everything else, because trade unions going, oh, we can't break the law. It isn't good enough, because eventually you will be breaking the law, whether you like it or not, because they will make you breaking the law. Most of our community weren't breaking the law before this bill was coming out. right? But we will be breaking it afterwards. So you just keep that in mind, that things change. And once we're dealt with and we've been picked off of the pack, other people will be too. And let's not forget that disabled people have been abused for the last 10 years and thrown under the bus. So, and it can happen to anybody. So I just want to make that clear. Anyway, thanks.
And just to add to the points that have already been made, especially linking it to the Sarah Everard case, when the news came out about how she had died, it was just fascinating to see how there were more politicians still calling for more police, especially with this case, especially with what we know and what the individual has been charged with. And I think in politics, there's this de facto position that, oh, when it comes to violence against women and girls, when it comes to racism, when it comes to all of these different issues, let's just invest in more kind of carceral solutions rather than looking at social and economic causes, rather than looking at the fact that disproportionately women are on the minimum wage, are in situations where they are financially insecure, that we are not teaching consent and healthy relationships in sex and relationship classes in school, that workplaces don't have reporting tools, all of these, amazing things that we need to be doing, including the Istanbul Convention and all sorts of other conventions that we need to sign up to. It's just, let's get more police, let's increase policing powers, let's introduce 500 new women's places in prisons, even though all the research shows that that is not what you should be doing, and that's what the government has also admitted to. And I think that we need more people in politics who have that kind of politics to look beyond policing to solve the issues that are deeply structural. Everyone's frozen. Or are they just silent? Sorry.
We're not frozen. We're struck by your words.
No, I was just because I saw a question earlier that reminded me of what you were saying, so I was trying to find it. And again, this goes to anyone. Someone has asked, in moving beyond the police, something often people say is that this kind of abolition is airy-fairy and wishy-washy and unrealistic in practice. How do you respond to that when trying to argue to move beyond the police?
I mean, I can take that, and I can take that with the caveat that, look, I think abolition throws down a really interesting challenge to old human rights institutions like Liberty, and there's still conversations that Liberty has to have and our 10,000 members need to have about where we might stand on abolition. But a human rights analysis also, if you're going to look at whether or not something that interferes with human rights should happen, often with qualified rights, the analysis that you do is you go, well, is it lawful? Is there a law that lets you do it? Is it legitimate? I.e., is it an effective means of reaching a legitimate aim? And finally, is it proportionate? And in that, you have to look at, are there less restrictive options? And this is where I see the interesting convergence between human rights and what, a lot of abolitionist campaigners are saying. Because what we're really asking is, what are the alternatives and why haven't we considered them? And is what we have actually effective? I find it really fascinating that, it's kind of taboo to even ask, but is this working? Will this prevent the harm in the future? Or is it, like, if you want it to be a deterrent, is it actually deterring people? Like, we don't even, before you even get to abolition, we don't even have those questions in kind of boring human rights terms. And I think what we really have to do is, we get stuck in these very boring but very trapping false binaries whereby we get to, well, it's prison or nothing, well, it's policing or nothing. And actually, it becomes taboo to ask, but what if there was something? What if we just wanted to talk about it? What if we wanted to explore it? What if somebody wanted to pilot it, right? All of that, all of a sudden, becomes very scary to people. But actually, that's what people are calling for when they're saying, defund this and invest in this. They're asking, where are the alternatives? And I think that the pandemic has really shone a light on that. And that was why that's why we did that Protect Everyone bill as an alternative to the Coronavirus Act, because that kind of really trapping lockdown skeptic or lockdown supporter binary, it became, well, either you support more police powers and more fines, or you support leaving people behind and the virus going everywhere. And what we weren't having a conversation was about how might we support people without punishing them to comply with public health guidance. Why don't we talk about unsafe workplaces and how we enforce against them? Why don't we talk about providing accommodation for people to isolate outside of their homes? Why don't we talk about proper sick pay? You know, so we get trapped in these binaries. And as I say, you know, there's a lot that the human rights movement can be in conversation with when it comes to abolition. And I think really it comes down to, why are we trapped with only these things or nothing? Why aren't we talking about the alternatives? We should all be able to agree on that.
Thanks. Does anyone else have anything to add on this point of abolition and moving beyond the idea of the police?
Do you want to go, Moya?
I don't know. No, yeah, you go, Luke. You go.
Okay. So what I was going to say is that this idea that we're talking abolition or we're talking prisons and stuff like that ignores the big sort of elephant in the room, and the fact is that, you know, the current prison system doesn't work. Like, you're ignoring the big elephant in the room when you go, oh yeah, it must be prison or this. It's because it literally doesn't work. If I'm experiencing a hate crime and I get murdered in the streets, right? My family, when they put that murderer in prison, when he gets out, they're not necessarily safer. Because if he gets out and he's likely to reoffend, well, that hasn't made me, another person like me, not experience murder, if you get what, it hasn't really protected anybody. So we need to talk about, you know, a criminal justice system that actually works. And I've got sort of an answer to the previous speaker that I think, you know, they might be kind of tied up and they might not be able to go into a bit more detail because of their positions and things. But what I would say is it's about criminality. Things like, you can't fill up, you know, the pockets of Serco and G4S with abolitionist solutions. You can't farm people in prisons for cheap labor with abolitionist, you know, thing. And let's look at who's going to run all these secure schools and all this, you know, stuff. You know, it's academy chains, you know, Harris Academy and all the rest of them, crooks is what I call them, frankly. And G4S and every Serco, all, you know, all the Tories' mates. That's why they love prisons. It's not because they do anything or keep anyone safe. It's because they can farm us all for money. And let's talk about why is everybody in prison, right? They're you know, the law doesn't apply to everybody equally. Rich people are already getting away with everything. So, you know, more legislation only applies to us at the bottom, frankly speaking. And I think we need to talk about that more. The fact that it's racialized groups, minorities in prison. And it's not because we're more inherently criminal. And this idea that Priti Patel goes on the board of deputies and go, you know, gypsies and travellers are all biologically predisposed to crime. And it's like, well, most crime, like, I'm not saying all of it, but most crime is because of economic situations, socio-economic situations. The fact that people are in, you know, sort of risky work or work that, you know, is precarious, and, you know, all these sorts of issues. And that's why people go, oh, I can't feed my child, I'm gonna, you know, steal baby formula. And people get criminalized for stealing baby formula. In a proper society with this amount of money, that person would never see a prison. They wouldn't even see the justice system. So yeah, I think we need to think about those sorts of things. And look, I always say this, right? How can police save us when, you know, communities like us, people only looked around and said the prison system and everything like that, you know, it's only a problem now that white women are getting their necks kneed on, putting people's knees on them and things like that, when we saw, you know, the vigil and stuff. It's like communities like mine have had this the whole time. It shouldn't just be shocking when it's, you know, a white university student or whatever. This should be shocking all the way around. And I also think, on an abolition perspective, and I don't want to take up too much time, but I just want to mention sex workers, because at the minute there's a Labour MP that is intent on criminalising sex workers, right? Well, criminalising their clients. So it's actually more nefarious than that. And sex workers have come along and said, this will get women killed. Right. And this is a Yorkshire MP, and we know what happened in Yorkshire. We don't need to go through and give everyone the trauma, right? I think that's personally, and it's not for me as a man to say, but I personally think that's a disgrace, frankly. And we know that putting sex workers more to do with the police, where the police are more likely to be abusers, things like this, it puts women in danger. So I think we need to talk about the fact that legislation can't always solve the problems that legislation actually creates in the first place. So let's not forget people like sex workers either, and make sure that, you know, we don't forget them, because at the end of the day, they're the people that experience a lot of the lion's share of, you know, male violence as well. Let's be frank. And when people like kill people, they tend to be victims a lot too. So it's really awful. But so we need to listen to people who are actually affected. Like if the government listened to people from my community and told them the solutions, we wouldn't be in this case where they're going to try and take our children away and make us homeless and take all our assets away. So yeah, thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. I'll go to you next, Moya. And I was just looking in the chat at the different questions, and so while you're answering, thinking about what alternatives to prison would you suggest be put in place for offenders who present kind of serious threat to members of society?
Well, I don't know if I'm best placed to answer this because I don't work with offenders who pose a serious threat to society, and I can't speak for the successes of processes that I would normally talk about, which is, you know, like transformative justice. But all I know is that the current, as Luke has pointed out, and as I pointed out on the panel, that the current carceral system we exist in doesn't stop reoffending in that sense, and it's not fit for purpose. And there must be something better than this that serves both the community and maybe can lead to rehabilitation. But I don't think that I'm best placed to answer that question, to be honest, because I wouldn't want to just like speak on it if I didn't have the full breadth of knowledge around what that would look like in terms of serious offenders, as we're terming it.
No worries. Unless anyone else has any thoughts on that, I'll move on to some of the other questions. Okay, so ahead of this panel, we also had a lot of questions on how to actually stop this bill and how to organise. And so one of them was for Zarah. As the Tories have a majority, do you actually believe there is a chance of stopping this bill in terms of processes in Parliament?
So like the question mentions, the Tories have this majority and they can pass absolutely anything that they want. It passed its second reading on the 16th of March, 359 votes to 263. And we know that the consecutive parts of the process were meant to take place quite quickly after that, but the large scale mobilizations have delayed it. Which shows that there is power in the streets to really affect the way that this bill's process in Parliament plays out. While, you know, let's be honest, they can pass it in the next stages quite easily. They can ignore everything that's happening. But what we need to do is continue mobilizing on numbers that effectively make it unworkable. And we've seen this in the past with the poll tax. And the way I would say it is the power of protest is going to have to be the thing that defends the right to protest. So the mobilizations that we're seeing weekly, there's on the 1st of May, more demonstrations. There's the one in London, we've got one in Coventry and across the country as well. We just need to make sure that we're building those coalitions. We're talking to people in our community. We're coming out in force. We're doing all the stuff that you also have to do with your MPs, especially, I would say, Conservative MPs that have marginals. If people, you know, are constituents of those MPs, exert your pressure. Those MPs are, you know, meant to serve you. They're meant to work for you. Make them earn that vote or whatever, and not just wait until elections to demonstrate that. So I think it's really important that we exercise all means, and especially, you know, mobilizing in communities and in demonstrations.
Thank you. And in the chat as well, one of the questions was, how can the general public be persuaded that the bill is an extreme breach of democratic rights, especially if most of the general public don't care about this or they don't have the capacity to bother about this? What kind of arguments would you use? Anyone?
I mean, maybe Pollen will prove me wrong here, but I feel like maybe the message is getting through that it is, you know, an extreme breach of democratic rights. That I would say this bill is so terrible, so all-encompassing of every sort of issue across the spectrum that you could think of. As Gracie said earlier, it puts together several different initiatives that the Home Office has been trying to drive through in terms of punitive punishing, that the general public are already slightly listening. The fact we've seen such mass widespread protests, I think the thing to focus on if you're trying to convince a non-believer, as it were, which is difficult, is again that idea of being free to move around public space. So one of the things that I think we've touched upon a bit with this bill, but maybe haven't nailed down, is that what it really seeks to do is change the way we move as citizens through public space. it's, you know, criminalizing nomadic communities, but criminalizing that space, that idea of trespass, the idea that we can't, you know, you can't go into a certain area, especially in like the countryside or fields or whatever. In the city as well, it would further show up the sort of pseudo public spaces that have been popping up. So, you know, you never know when you're actually trespassing anymore, because something looks like a public square and then you find out it's owned by this shadowy property company, and it's subject to all kinds of bylaws that you aren't even aware of. So I think that is, like, sadly, the idea of the encroachment on that public right to just be in space and not be criminalized. But I think we're already seeing the public have realized how deep this goes. And it's sad that it's taken something so extreme. It is sad that it's taken something so extreme for them to even sort of wake up and clock that. But yeah, I think it's the focus again on that idea of being able to exist in public, move around public space, have that right to just go about your business or express any sort of dissent, and, you know, stress that the chipping away of these rights means that if this bill goes through, in 10 years or so, in your 20 years, you have the next generation coming through. The things that we see as normal now, or even that are starting to be encroached upon, like the right to protest, the right to move around, the right to, you know, walk through a field and not be cuffed, that will not seem normal anymore. That sort of like freedom will not seem normal, and that's the freedom that we have to tell people we are protecting. So yeah, those are the things I said we should focus on. But if it was obviously an ideal world, we'd be focusing on the harm it's doing to marginalized groups. But unfortunately, as has been pointed out in the chat, then a lot of the general public are just trying to keep their head above water and don't have time for extending all their empathy.
If I can come in on that, I think we also need to draw broader links. So like I mentioned earlier, there's this broader context to the authoritarianism. We've seen conservative supporters be installed as the chairman of the BBC. We've seen anti-migrant rhetoric. From the get-go from this government, we've heard proposals of putting gunships in the channel to deter asylum seekers, and we've heard plans to put asylum seekers miles away on an island, like what they do in Australia. Also new voter ID laws which would disproportionately affect Gypsy, Roma, and Traveller communities and other marginalised groups, because they want to suppress turnout of working class people who are statistically more likely to be voting Labour. There's also the redrawing of constituency boundaries, again, to rig more votes in their favour. And all of this, especially I think with this bill, it's setting the groundwork for what's to come. So while we're going through this moment of social and economic crisis because of the pandemic, we know that the climate crisis is the biggest crisis of them all. And as we see more of that play out in our daily lives, it's happening already. But when we see the unemployment grow and be, you know, the worst in generations, we're going to see more people want to come out to the streets, want to organize, and this is the government essentially preparing for that, so that new police powers essentially quell that dissent. And this is essentially just the starting point of that. And I think it's really important that people are made aware of those things, that this is them preparing for what is to come, and we need to prepare on a scale that's even bigger, essentially.
Thanks. Okay, so I'm just seeing what other audience questions came in. One of them was around the fact that the bill was slightly delayed. And again, anyone can answer this. Do you feel like this is something we should be celebrating? Is this a good thing, or is this another kind of stall tactic because of all the protests?
I think we need to celebrate wins wherever we find them, because it's an incredibly bleak place we find ourselves in, and there is a direct correlation between what we saw at Clapham Common and the vigil and the demonstration straight after that, and what happened in Parliament. There was an outpouring of anger, you know, and gal-dem and Tribune and other left media and alternative media covered it before a lot of mainstream media did. They didn't want to talk about a lot of the issues. So I think we need to celebrate what that moment achieved, but also knowing that the work didn't end there. We can't just pack our bags and say we're done, because the process is not over, and we need to keep building momentum and know that it will come back to Parliament, and we need to be preparing for that as well, but also beyond the parliamentary process, which is what instigated a lot of this anyway.
Thank you. Does anyone else have any thoughts on that? Gracie, I saw you shaking your head or nodding your head.
No, not nodding, not shaking. I mean, Zara's absolutely right. It is a win. It's a win to be celebrated. I suppose I'm just thinking about what I'm thinking about is the extent to which this bill, the edges are taken off this bill, but what happens more broadly. Because I think what I'm really interested in is how do we get to a place where bringing forward this kind of legislation is just politically untenable? That's what I'm interested in, because I think, as I've said already, when you look at, this bill is ostensibly, and when you look at all the press releases that came out about it initially, which are fascinating because it's literally covered as a bill to, stop child sex abuse. And those parts of the bill are completely commendable, but why you would package them up, well, we know why you would package them up with the rest of it. But like, that wasn't what this bill was badged as, about being about safer communities. And when you look at what this bill says about safety, it's saying pretty loudly who the bill's intended to keep safe from who. So what I'm interested in is how we get to a place where a bill like this is not what is understood by politicians to be community safety. I think, when it comes to the parliamentary process, there are going to be some areas where there's cross-party consensus and where I think there is scope for wins. But the worst excesses and the worst bits of this bill, I mean, Luke, I see you shaking your head. I think there are Conservative backbenchers that will support on protest, but that is about it. I think the worst bits, the bits that are really gunning for marginalised communities, they're not going to come out for. When we look at the article that Steve Baker and Dominic Grieve joined forces to write for Conservative Home or Politics Home, it was very much, real concerns about protest. All this stuff on unauthorised encampments totally justified, right? So we already see where those parliamentary coalitions are going to be. And that's why, while I want people to continue to mobilise, and I think it's really important, what I'm really interested in is the movement that outlasts and outlives this bill and makes bills like this in the future politically impossible. That's what I'm really interested in.
Go on, Luke. I know you want to respond.
Yeah, I do want to a bit. Yeah, no, I actually agree with that, like pretty much everything that was just said. But I do want to say on this idea of basically what this is going towards is an authoritarian police state, and this is like a sort of enabling act in what they're doing now. And I just kind of wanted to say, about sort of reaching out to people, making a broad coalition and things like that. I don't think this needs to be as much, it don't need to be as big as people think. I think trade unions getting behind this, the members of trade unions would be big enough to bring this country to its knees and stop this bill going through. The truth is that I think they also need to realize is that this idea that, oh yeah, there's COVID regulations, so we can't go out and protest and things like that. They need to realize that this government doesn't have the ordinary decorum that normal governments have. It doesn't have that, and they need to really wisen up to this. And the charities are finding out very quickly, and they've been threatened. The Runnymede Trust and everybody else is being threatened at the minute to shut up about this bill, about the race report and everything else. So I think we need to we don't have to say, oh, Gypsies and Travellers are the most popular people ever, and that's why we need to campaign on this bill. We're not sort of, I'm not in any other sort of illusion that we're a popular community. And I'm not saying go and campaign on us, but all I would say is you need to explain to people that this is how they work, is that they pick off communities and they blame it because we're facing a new Gilded Age at the minute, where in the next 10 years, we're potentially going to have trillionaires, not billionaires, trillionaires. And they used to have this economic thing, the economy is going well with Margaret Thatcher or whatever, people are owning more homes, and then they created a consensus that way. Well, our economy is actually deflating more heavily than most other economies. And they're actually afraid, my personal opinion is that they're afraid of the 2010 riots, but on a mass scale, when people start, when this all comes to crunch and people can't, feed their families as well as they could, mass unemployment, I think they're tooling up to deal with that sort of situation. And I think it needs to be said that they have to blame minorities, and when they're finished with my minority, when they're finished with my community, they will have to find other communities. And the truth is because once they've started, they have to keep feeding people to the machine. And because once they have nobody to feed to the machine, there's only them left to blame for all society's ills. So they have to find minorities, trans people, sex workers, gypsies and travellers, migrants, all of these things. And we need to explain to ordinary people that, not just people that are racialized groups, or I guess I say ordinary, I mean, that's kind of a dodgy word, but I guess we've been trained to think that we're not ordinary, even though we are. But that's a different discussion, I guess. It's like internalized racism. But we need to explain that once they're finished with us, it will be another group, and they have to keep going, because they're not just going to say, oh, it was us that did it all, because then they'll be voted out of power, and that doesn't make any sense. So they have to keep finding like the bogeyman in society, basically. And I think once you explain that to a lot of people, they have a lot more sympathy for it. But the NGOs and the trade unions, like I say, they are going to need to, eventually, they are going to be on the chopping board, and it's not just going to be their funding, it's going to be them all together. And that's what we're starting to experience. And like these people's whose organizations it is to hold the government account on race and equality are now not even allowed to do that. Like, what sort of society does that say? Yeah, like we are going towards a fascist police state, and it's pretty awful, and people really do need to be made aware.
Thank you. Okay, so we'll be wrapping up shortly, and I'm just trying to get through some of the final questions. One from earlier was whether panelists, anyone, feels like this would have happened, whether this bill would have gone through had it not been for the public health crisis. I know you mentioned earlier, Zarah, how it was pushed through Parliament. Do you think that it provided the perfect kind of smokescreen? Would it have happened anyway?
I think the pandemic has provided a smokescreen to a lot of anti-human rights, civil liberties legislation. But this Conservative government, like Luke and others have mentioned, isn't like others that we've experienced before. We've seen right-wing Tories before, but this party has been completely purged of any one nation Toryism following Brexit. So this is a party that is very much the most right-wing. I mean, I'm not a historian, but I would say at least I can use my lifetime as an example to say that the most right-wing that we've ever had. And they think of themselves above accountability, above anyone else. We've seen that with the contracts that they've been giving out. We've seen that with the communications, the kind of sleaze that people are using. If it was any other country, we'd be using the word corruption, but there's a legal implication there, so we're not, basically. And all of these things tell you exactly what this government thinks of the people that live here, but also of themselves and their friends and their chums. So they would have done it anyway. They would have passed this legislation because it is purely ideological. We were talking about, why, when we're talking about safeguarding and well-being, do we always end up, talking about more policing or, all of these things that have social economic kind of solutions? Why do we always turn to kind of more kind of authoritarian policies? It's because they are pursuing an ideological mandate here, or agenda anyway, and that's literally fueling it. So, and that will be the case until I would say we have a change of government, but also until we really change the way we do politics in this country. I'm knocking on doors still now, and people are still like, yeah, I'm not interested in politics, but it doesn't affect me. And I think as a Labour Party MP, and as someone who has a background in community organising, and now that my party is getting rid of the community organising unit, I think that is a huge failure, because that's how we build power. Power isn't in Westminster, it's not in those lobbies or whatever, it's with ordinary people, and that's how they're able to maintain their kind of status quo, because everyone else is too worried because they're working those precarious jobs that Luke mentioned. They're not able to feed their kids. That we've become a nation of food banks and 0-hour contracts, and that's what allows the rest of this bullshit essentially to continue.
Thanks. Okay, so before we wrap up, a quick go around. Do you feel confident that this bill will be defeated? Any final words? Optimistic, pessimistic?
Difficult. I think the people united will never be defeated. That's probably what I'd have to say. I think we have a fighting chance, I think we have more of a fighting chance than we've had of any sort of piece of legislation in the last 5 years. And that gives me hope. As I said before, I think it's this bill is such an overreach of punitive policing powers and such an expansion that it has managed to piss off people from every single sort of marginalized group. And we talked a bit about that coalition that we've got to build, and we are building. And I think Luke brilliantly highlighted how, you know, the Tory tactics, the tactics of fascists, that is just picking off different groups and pitting them against each other. But this bill has maybe finally I'm seeing the kernels of people actually coming together and being like, you know what, we've got to stand in solidarity. And that's something I've seen at all the protests. So on the basis of that, I'm going to say never give up hope. And as Gracie was talking about, whatever's ignited from this, carry that through, because the only way we're going to win this battle in the long term is that coalition, and making sure we see the commonalities between our struggles and stand in solidarity with everyone who is penalised by the state, by this government, and just by the sort of like late stage capitalism's hell we live in.
Thanks. Okay, Gracie?
Yeah, I mean, look, as someone who's had a foot in activist spaces and another foot and most of my head in policy spaces for the last 5 years, I mean, this is the most exciting mobilization about a piece of legislation that I've ever seen. It's not like I have a long career, but like, it's really exciting. This is the kind of thing where when you look at a piece of draft legislation and you think, oh my goodness, this has got some really horrible bits in it. Yes, we will communicate about it, but is anyone going to care? Like, it's amazing to see the mobilization. And it's really, I'm really heartened by the work that people have done actually to insist it's not just protest, it's all these other bits of the bill as well, because that's the thing that often gets lost when you're dealing with legislation, is people will fixate on, you know, the bit that's most palatable, and the bit that's in theory got the broadest appeal, and everything else gets left by the wayside. And I mean, I haven't watched a parliamentary debate live since like 2017, when I cried at the state of what was going on with the data protection bill and migrants just getting thrown under the bus. So I mean, that's exciting, right? It's exciting, even if it is in the face of something really grim. And, you know, the other thing that I think in terms of the more general context that Zarah, you've spoken to and I've spoken about in terms of this war on accountability and war on the mechanisms that we use to hold power to account, I mean, it is also the state running scared. It's because those mechanisms work that the state is running scared, that this government has brought this legislation. So I think, you know, all of it is a signal to the fact that collectively we are powerful. So yeah, I mean, I'll take heart from that. As I've said, in terms of a very dry parliamentary coalition, what's going to happen with amendments, I don't have huge confidence on all aspects of the worst bits of the bill. But I'm always very open to being surprised. You can't do this job and become cynical, because you just become awful or you have to leave. So you can't be cynical. And we've just seen the work of Freedom from Torture and others push the government into this massive climb down. Yes, albeit on decriminalising torture, a climb down nonetheless with an 80-seat majority. You know, let's take it. So yeah, shoulders to the wheel, and let's keep up the fight.
Zarah, Luke, any final words?
I would want to echo everything that Moya and Gracie have said about keeping hope. I think if you become too pessimistic, it becomes incredibly difficult to work in these spaces. So we have to be hopeful, and I am incredibly hopeful. Being at the demonstrations, seeing how young, how diverse, you know, people from all backgrounds really angry about this. And you know, I actually, with the previous two bills that happened, speaking up against them in Parliament and kind of just doing that stuff and them passing, this bill feels different. There has been a reaction to it that has been very different. There has been the reaction by the government that has been very different. They've ignored the rest of the criticisms, although you know they're making some exemptions now because of some of the outrage. But that gives me hope, and I think we have to keep building. While this is possibly going to pass, we have to make sure it's unworkable. We need to be preparing for what's to come. And like Gracie said, you know, the movement is something that is long lasting. It doesn't, you know, exist because of Parliament and because of laws. It exists because the people need movements to fight for their rights regardless. So I think it's really important that we are building. And I think, you know, one thing to learn from being on the left and being in the Labour Party is that maybe some of the lessons that we should learn learned from the past few years were how we might have neglected movement building and supporting grassroots mobilizations and grassroots organizing, and putting all of our eggs in one basket when it comes to parliamentary mechanisms. So I think it's something to be conscious of, but also knowing that we have to work with both sides of the coin.
Okay, Luke, you've got like 30 seconds.
Yeah, I'm going to be super quick. So all I wanted to say was the fact is, right, is that we're often some of the first to be targeted by regimes like this, but we're never the last. So remember that you are always potentially going to be there. I was demoralised by seeing Tory MPs and MPs get up driving the stake in further against my community. I was absolutely demoralised. And Sisters Uncut came out of absolutely nowhere, reached out to our community and showed us the light, basically. When have you ever seen gypsies and travellers in the streets, hand in hand, shoulder to shoulder with Black Lives Matter, trans people, sex workers, everybody out in the street together, trade unionists, literally everybody, right? We don't need that many people to bring this government, bring this bill down, right? So there's the hope there. So yeah, get out in the streets and show them where to shove this bill, basically. That's all I'm going to say. So thanks for having me.
Thanks so much. I'm glad it kind of ended on a positive note. So thanks so much to everyone for joining this debate, and to all our panelists and our audience. Thank you, Moya, Zarah, Gracie and Luke, for taking time out of your day to talk about this issue. And with all of these panelists, follow them on Twitter, watch their updates about the bill, and keep updated. And we hope to see you next week. We do have a weekly debate, so you can check our website and our social media, and my colleague will put the link in the chat to the live discussions. We also have a weekly newsletter, and Open Democracy does rely on contributions and donations. So if you want to see more public interest journalism like this, please do consider supporting Open Democracy. And thank you again. Hopefully see you all next week.